Background. I work summers as a camp counsellor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based on. So, like a routine camping trip, we canoe out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my co-counsellor, Matt, take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, play games, etc. We cook some food over the fire, sat around and tell stories, cook s'mores, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30ish, I tell the kids it's time for bed, and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still in line of sight from where we had the fire pit. So, the kids are gone to bed. Matt and I are shooting the shit by the water, smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out before we decide to head to our tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day, and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water when we saw a small light approaching us slowly and slightly above the water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it is important to note that as a camp counsellor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we are responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we are camping with a group from a recognised organisation and we would respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone as the light drew nearer. Paddling this kayak was a woman, looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of grey hair that were trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all the wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realised that she was missing most of her teeth. "Are all your children safe in bed?" she asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond, and quite frankly shitting myself, I responded by telling her that they were fine and that she had to leave. "That's good, just as expected for this time," she said, with a smile, then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, Matt and I, who were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a freaking corpse, but also her inquiry into the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on the trip. At this point in time, Matt and I were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a fucking corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on this trip. Not knowing what else we could do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later is where shit started to get really creepy. Across the lake, a female counsellor was leading another trip for kids the same age as our group. She sent a text which read something along the lines of, "Hey Sean, stop screwing with us, this isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know that I had just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie and that I was not trying to play a joke. Apparently, one of their kids had opened their tent door to take a piss and seen a woman with long hair standing with her arms open towards them near the shoreline. Last summer, my boyfriend and I went camping in some nature reserve in Pennsylvania. I can't remember the name. It was a pretty primitive camping. No cell service, and we saw 2 other people there in the entire place. It was huge, so it was pretty empty. My boyfriend pretty much immediately said these 2 people seemed off to him right away. I don't know if they had anything to do with what happened that night, but I'll describe them. The first person was a woman who had her truck parked off the trail and hood open. I don't really notice these types of things, but my boyfriend said it looked to him like she was waiting for someone to pull off beside her and offer to help with her truck. Normally, my boyfriend is the type to at least offer to call someone, but he said she skeeved him out enough, he didn't even want to draw her attention more than what's necessary. The next person we saw drove by several times while we were setting up. He just kept driving by slowly and looking at us. I didn't even notice though, until my boyfriend pointed out that he'd already done it twice. Whether these 2 people had anything sinister going on or not, the real story has to do with what woke us around 3 a.m. It was incredibly loud and sudden. I couldn't describe it or even compare it to anything, but my boyfriend said it sounded to him similar to a chain gun revving up, or someone using some large tool to scrape gravel. my boyfriend jumped up and looked out the little window of the tent. The sound happened again, and it was getting noticeably closer each time. I was about to piss myself, but my boyfriend told me it was probably miles off. I didn't question this because loud noises can be heard from miles off, right? Well, later my boyfriend told me that because he didn't want to scare me. It really sounded like it was coming from right down the little dirt road. At one point, he said he suspected it was right in front of our campsite. The only reason he didn't tell me to get out and dart for the car was because he was afraid it could be someone trying to scare us out of the tent for some dreadful reason. He whispered. I should have noticed he was whispering and knew something was wrong, since otherwise he'd just speak normally, right? For me to just go back to sleep. However, I could not, because every little sound I heard outside sounded like someone sneaking up to the tent. Eventually, my boyfriend told me to get out and help him pack up. It was maybe 20 minutes after the sound stopped. He held our only weapon, a machete, in front of him. It was a full moon or close to it, so he didn't need a light. While we were packing quickly, I noticed an empty beer can close to our dead campfire. It wasn't there when we went to sleep at around 10 PM, and neither of us even brought any beer. Thankfully we got out of there, and for the rest of the trip, we either camped in areas well populated by other campers, or we got a hotel room. So, whoever or whatever that was, let's never meet. I grew up just north of New York City. Living in a pretty densely populated metropolitan area, I always look forward to summer, when my father and I went backpacking upstate. We had a spot about an hour north of Lake George, in the Adirondacks, and camped a few nights every summer. One trip, a few years back now, we were driving to the trailhead. On a long, narrow dirt road, we saw a car pulled over, with a few people arguing outside the car. This isn't the most secluded spot in the world, so it's not uncommon to see another family. But it was weird that a car would be pulled over here, with no real access to any trails. As we drove closer, a man walked over and waved at us. We assumed they were having car trouble. My father rolled down his window. Suddenly a female in the group screamed, "Get away from him!" The man suddenly had a serious face and began sprinting towards us. He was tall and well built, and moving quickly. My father slammed on his brakes and quickly pulled the car into reverse. The man stopped and let out a sigh. We just sat there, parked, confused. The man reached towards us. We were a good 10 or so yards away. Then he darted off the road and into the woods. Cautiously, at this point, we drove slowly towards the parked car. There were 3 women, crying. They were his sisters, and apparently he had just returned home from the army a few months prior. According to the women, shortly after he got back, he began acting odd and was diagnosed with PTSD, as well as early onset Alzheimer's disease. The women got back in their car and headed for town. They said that they were going to the ranger station to get help locating him. The rest of the day was fairly uneventful. We hiked to our campsite, fished for a bit, and set up camp for the night. Sitting next to the fire, my father and I felt some strange vibes. We weren't sure whether the women were telling the truth, or if the man was trying to ask us for our help. What was more disturbing was the fact that we were camping only a few miles away from where this man ran off. We weren't sure if he was violent, armed, or if he had followed us. Typically, my father and I sleep in separate bivvy tents, but we decided to stay in the shelter that night. It was basically a small log cabin with 3 walls and an open front, where the fire pit was located. Neither of us slept too much that night. It's probably just my imagination, but I swear I felt I was being watched, though my father and I didn't hear footsteps or anything out of the ordinary. The next morning, I left camp to take a leak. A few hundred feet away from our camp, I saw a small fire pit right on the trail. I placed my hands on the ashes. They were soaked. Someone had a fire here and very recently poured water on it. We had food and supplies for 4 nights, but after I found that fire pit, we broke camp and left that morning. So, to that strange man, let's not meet. I'm not sure if I'm in the right place, but I've held on to this story for the last 6 years because it sounds crazy, and I got told not to talk about it. I went camping 6 years ago with an now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful. We were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere, Absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, and came back and had dinner. It was all very normal, until we woke up the next day. I need to give some context as to how we slept that night so you can understand my confusion. Before we went to sleep, put our food cooler and our stereo that we bought back in the car and locked it. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and I put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent, away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept nearest to the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning and felt fine. I had slept hard, and from inside the tent everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces laying next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off now. It was quiet, and not the beautiful campsite we had saw yesterday. Everything about those woods felt wrong now. My ex accused me of not locking the car the night before, and that an animal got into our stuff. I promised that I had locked it, and went to the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home, and told me that he had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent holding his gun and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again, and said he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it to anyone either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night.